The Oakville Animal Shelter was a place of both hope and heartbreak. On any given day, its kennels housed dozens of animals, each with a story as unique as the patterns in their fur. But even among this menagerie of the lost and forgotten, there was something special about the dog in kennel number 7. He was a German shepherd, once majestic, but now a shadow of his former self. His coat, which had been glossy and thick, hung in dull, matted clumps. His eyes, usually bright and alert in his breed, were clouded with a pain that seemed to go beyond the physical. But it was his cry that truly set him apart, a mournful, teeing sound that echoed through the shelter day and night. Sarah Chun, the shelter's lead caretaker, had seen her fair share of abandoned animals in her 15 years on the job. But something about this dog tugged at her heartstrings in a way she couldn't ignore. She had taken to calling him Max, though she knew better than to name the animals. It made it harder when they left, or worse, when they didn't. "Hey there, big guy," Sarah said, approaching Max's kennel with slow, deliberate movements. "How are you doing today?" Max's ears perked up at the sound of her voice, but the hopeful light in his eyes quickly dimmed. He let out another heart-wrenching whine, his tail giving a half-hearted thump against the concrete floor. Sarah sighed, her heart heavy. It had been 3 days since Max had been brought in, and in that time, he barely touched his food or water. His cries had only grown more frequent and distressed. "I wish you could tell me what's wrong," Sarah murmured, carefully opening the kennel door. She knelt beside Max, running her hand gently along his side. She frowned as she felt the protruding ribs. "You need to eat, sweetie. We can't help you if you won't help yourself." As if in response, Max let out another cry, this one softer, but somehow even more pained. He turned his head toward Sarah, and for a moment, she could have sworn she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not just pain or fear, but understanding. Sarah shook her head, chiding herself for anthropomorphizing. Max was suffering, that much was clear, but projecting human emotions onto him wouldn't help. What he needed was professional help. With determined set to her jaw, Sarah stood up. "All right, Max," she said, her voice firm but kind. "I think it's time we got you checked out properly." The local veterinary clinic was small but well-equipped, run by Dr. James Thoron, a man whose compassion for animals was matched only by his skill in treating them. Sarah had known him for years, and if anyone could figure out what was wrong with Max, it was Dr. Thoron. "Sarah." The vet greeted her warmly as she entered the clinic, Max held securely on a leash beside her. "What brings you in today?" His eyes fell on Max, and his expression softened. "And who's this handsome fellow?" "This is Max," Sarah explained, giving the dog a reassuring pat. "He was brought into the shelter 3 days ago. The owner said they couldn't keep him anymore." She trailed off, her brow furrowed with concern. Dr. Thoron nodded, understanding the unspoken worry in Sarah's voice. "But you think there's more to the story," he finished for her. "He won't stop crying," Sarah said, her voice cracking slightly. "He barely eats or drinks. I know it's normal for dogs to be distressed when they're first brought in, but this feels different." The vet knelt down, speaking softly to Max as he began a preliminary examination. "Hey there, big guy, let's see what's going on with you, shall we?" Max whimpered, but allowed Dr. Thoron to check him over. The vet's hands moved gently but efficiently, years of experience guiding his examination. "He's definitely underweight." Dr. Thoron murmured more to himself than to Sarah. "Coat's in bad shape, too. Could be neglect, or could be a sign of underlying health issues." As the examination continued, Dr. Thoron's frown deepened when he palpated Max's abdomen. The dog let out a yelp of pain so sharp that Sarah flinched. "I don't like the feel of his abdomen," the vet said, his voice tight with concern. "It's distended and seems tender. I'd like to do some x-rays and blood work." Sarah nodded, her worry growing. "Of course, whatever he needs." The next hour was a flurry of activity. Max was surprisingly cooperative as the clinic staff took blood samples and prepared him for x-rays. It was as if he understood they were trying to help him, his cries quieting to soft whimpers. When the results came back, the atmosphere in the examination room changed palpably. Dr. Thoron's face was grave as he beckoned Sarah over to look at the x-rays illuminated on the light box. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and serious, I need you to call 911 right now." Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. "What? Why? What's wrong with him?" Dr. Thoron pointed to several small, irregularly shaped objects visible in Max's abdominal cavity. "These are bullets. Sarah, at least 3 of them. This dog has been shot." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Sarah processed this information. "Shot?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "But how? Why?" "I don't know," Dr. Thoron said grimly. "But this is now a case of animal abuse. We need to report it to the authorities immediately, and Max needs emergency surgery. Those bullets need to come out now." As if on cue, Max let out another cry, this one weaker than before. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. How could anyone do this to such a gentle creature? With shaking hands, Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed 911. As she reported the situation to the dispatcher, her mind raced. Who had done this to Max? Was it the same person who had abandoned him at the shelter? How long had he been suffering like this? The next few hours passed in a blur. Police officers arrived to take statements and photographs. Dr. Thoron and his team prepped Max for emergency surgery. Through it all, Sarah stayed by Max's side, whispering words of comfort and encouragement. "You're going to be okay," she murmured, stroking his head gently as the anesthesia began to take effect. "We're going to take care of you. You're safe now." As Max was wheeled into surgery, Sarah found herself in the waiting room, her mind replaying every moment since Max had been brought to the shelter. Had there been signs she'd missed? Could she have figured this out sooner? Officer Elena Rodriguez, a kind woman with sharp eyes, sat down beside Sarah. "Miss Chun," she said gently, "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions about the dog." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "Of course. What do you need to know?" "Can you tell me about the day Max was brought in? Who brought him? Did they give any explanation?" Sarah closed her eyes, thinking back. "It was a man," she said slowly. "Middle-aged, I'd say. He said Max belonged to his elderly father, who had recently passed away. He claimed he couldn't keep the dog because of allergies." Officer Rodriguez nodded, making notes. "Did anything about his story seem off to you?" Sarah frowned, thinking hard. He seemed nervous at the time. "I thought it was just the stress of giving up a family pet. But now," she trailed off, a horrible thought occurring to her. "What is it?" Officer Rodriguez prompted gently. "He was wearing long sleeves," Sarah said, the memory suddenly crystal clear. "It was a hot day, but he had on a long sleeve shirt. And when he reached out to hand me Max's leash, I saw scratches on his wrist." Officer Rodriguez's eyes narrowed. "As if the dog had defended himself," she murmured. Sarah nodded, feeling sick. "Oh, God," she whispered. Do you think he was the one who shot Max?" "We can't jump conclusions," Officer Rodriguez said, her voice gentle but firm. "But it's certainly a possibility. We'll be investigating. Do you remember anything else about this man? Any distinguishing features? The car he drove? Anything at all?" Sarah racked her brain, tried to recall every detail of that day. "He had a scar," she said suddenly, "on his left cheek. And I think his car was a blue sedan, an older model." As Sarah continued to provide details to Officer Rodriguez, her mind kept drifting back to Max. The surgery had been going on for hours now. Was that a good sign or a bad one? Just as Sarah felt she might go mad from the waiting, Dr. Thornton emerged from the surgical suite. His scrubs were spattered with blood, and he looked exhausted, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "He made it through the surgery," Dr. Thornton announced, and Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. "We removed 3 bullets and repaired the damage they caused. It was touch and go for a while. He lost a lot of blood, but he's a fighter. Can I see him?" Sarah asked, her voice choked with emotion. Dr. Thornton nodded. "He's in recovery now. You can see him, but only for a few minutes. He needs rest." As Sarah followed Dr. Thornton to the recovery area, Officer Rodriguez touched her arm gently. "We'll need to take an official statement from you later," she said, "and we'll keep you updated on the investigation." Thank you for your help, Chun. You may have saved this dog's life in more ways than one. Max was lying on a padded table, hooked up to various monitors and 4 drips. His body had been shaved in several places, revealing angry red incisions held closed with neat rows of stitches. But as Sarah approached, his tail gave a weak thump, and he lifted his head slightly. "Hey, sweet boy," Sarah murmured gently, stroking the unshaved part of his head. "You did so well. You're so brave." Max whined softly, nuzzling into her hand. For the first time since he'd been brought to the shelter, his eyes seemed clear, the pain and fear replaced by a tentative trust. "I don't know what happened to you," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But I promise you it's over now. You're safe, and we're going to find you the best home with people who will love you and protect you the way you deserve." As the days passed, Max's recovery amazed everyone at the clinic. His wounds healed cleanly, and with proper nutrition and care, he began to regain weight. His coat, regularly brushed and treated, started to regain its lustrous sheen. But the most remarkable change was in his demeanor. The mournful cries that had once echoed through the shelter were replaced by excited barks when Sarah came to visit. His tail, once tucked fearfully between his legs, now wagged with joyful abandon. The police investigation progressed, aided by Sarah's description and the evidence collected from Max's surgically removed bullets. 2 weeks after Max's surgery, Officer Rodriguez arrived at the shelter with news. "We've made an arrest," she informed Sarah. "The man who brought Max in, his name is Robert Carlson. Turns out Max wasn't his father's dog at all. Carlson had stolen Max from his neighbor's yard, intending to sell him. But when Max fought back, Carlson panicked and shot him." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that the perpetrator had been caught, anger at the cruelty Max had endured, and a deep sadness for all that the dog had suffered. "What will happen to him?" Sarah asked. "He's facing charges of animal cruelty, theft, and illegal discharge of a firearm," Officer Rodriguez replied. "Given the evidence, it's likely he'll be convicted." Max's story has touched a lot of people. There's been significant public outcry. Indeed, as news of Max's ordeal spread, the community rallied around him. Donations poured into the shelter to cover his medical expenses. Local news stations ran features on his recovery. And perhaps most heartening of all, adoption offers began to flood in. But for Sarah, letting Max go was proving harder than she'd anticipated. Over the weeks of his recovery, she'd grown deeply attached to the resilient German shepherd. The thought of saying goodbye made her heart ache. It was Dr. Thornton who finally broached the subject during one of Max's checkups. "Sarah," he said gently, watching as she played with Max in the clinic's small yard, "have you considered adopting him yourself?" Sarah looked up, surprised. I didn't think I could," she admitted. "There are policies about staff adopting animals from the shelter." Dr. Thornton smiled. "I've spoken with the shelter board," he said. "Given the unique circumstances, they're willing to make an exception. If you want to, that is." Sarah looked at Max, who was looking back at her with those soulful eyes, his tail wagging hopefully. In that moment, she knew there was only one choice she could make. 2 months after he'd been abandoned at the shelter, Max, now officially named Maxwell Chun, went home with Sarah. His homecoming was a celebration, with friends, shelter staff, and even Officer Rodriguez stopping by to wish them well. As night fell and the last guest departed, Sarah sat on her couch, Max's head resting contentedly in her lap. She stroked his ears, marveling at how far they'd come. "You know," she said softly, "when you first came to us, I never imagined this is where we'd end up, but I'm so glad we did." Max looked up at her, his eyes full of love and trust. He gave a soft woof, as if in agreement, then snuggled closer. Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. Max's journey had been one of unimaginable cruelty, but it had led him here, to a place of love and safety. And in saving him, Sarah realized she had found a piece of herself she didn't know was missing. As she drifted off to sleep, Max, a warm, comforting presence beside her, Sarah thought about the long road ahead. There would be challenges, certainly. Max still had healing to do, both physically and emotionally, but they would face those challenges together. For Max was more than just a pet now. He was a survivor, a symbol of resilience, and a testament to the healing power of compassion. And for Sarah, he was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope could be found, sometimes in the most unexpected places. The once abandoned dog who had cried so mournfully in his kennel now slept peacefully, safe in the knowledge that he was home. And Sarah, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, knew that in giving Max a second chance at life, she had been given one too. Their story, born from tragedy, but blossoming into something beautiful, was just beginning. And whatever the future held, they would face it, as they had faced Max's recovery, with courage, compassion, and an unshakable bond that had been forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by love. As the night deepened and the stars twinkled outside, the house was quiet, save for the soft snoring of a dog who had finally found his forever home and the contented sigh of a woman who had found an unexpected answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. In the end, it wasn't just Max who had been rescued. In their own ways, they had rescued each other.